Hey everybody, welcome to XZ Chat. I'm Serge.
I'm Rob.
I'm Gen Z.
I'm Gen X.
And yesterday we did a reaction to The Lost Battalion. There was a song by Sabaton, and today what we're going to do is we're going to go learn the history behind it. We're going to learn about the Meuse Argonne offensive. Indy Nidell is going to fill us in along with the lead singer of the band, and we're going to see what it's all about. And I'm curious to know what caused the friendly fire incident. So.
Yeah, I think in the song they sang about a lot of death occurred from friendly fire.
Right,
Yeah. With
all
the chaos of this.
Yeah, but nevertheless, even though they were surrounded, they managed to break out of the encirclement. So let's learn about this piece of history.
Let's hear it.
All right.
I'm Indy Nidell.
And I'm Joachim from Sabaton, and this is Sabaton History.
And we are standing in the Argonne Forest where the Lost Battalion was lost during the First World War.
Wow, so actually
so
they are
let's
there.
find out more, shall we?
Oh, man. The Argonne is rough terrain, rocky hills and thick woodland, and it had been in German hands since the end of 1914. Now, in late September 1918, the Argonne was an important part of the strongest German position, the Hagenstellung. And as the Allies finally began to break through, it comes down to the Americans to push through that fortified maze of bushes and ravines. But the American forces had hardly any experience in this terrain, especially not the 77th Division. That division was mostly from New York, and they were former street kids, baseball players, thugs, gamblers, clerks, gangsters, shoemakers, bouncers, everything. And many were recent immigrants, men with Irish, German, Polish, or Russian heritage, Catholics, Protestants, and Jews. They were the most mixed bunch you could imagine, and just before they were shipped out to France, in April 1918, they had been bolstered with men from the Midwest. They were truly an all-American division.
Very eclectic.
The Meuse-Argonne offensive had been making progress, and despite heavy casualties, the Americans advanced several miles towards the Germans. By the end of September, the 77th Division stood deep in enemy territory. But progress was still way too slow for High Command's liking, and orders came to keep up the pace. As long as the official casualty list was still comparatively low, there was no need to stop. But for the men on the ground, this was easier said than done. Major Charles Whittlesey, in command of 9 companies of the 77th, complained to General Alexander, in overall command, that their flanks were constantly exposed, as the French forces on the left and the 308th Regiment on the right were not keeping up with them.
Oh.
That was indeed a major problem.
Yeah, I'm guessing that's how they got themselves surrounded. They're
Sure.
told to just keep moving even though their flank isn't covered, and then they just ended up going in too deep. But it's interesting as well. I wonder if the fact that it was such a ragtag bunch, like everyone just being thrown together and not being given maybe enough time to get used to each other, that caused maybe some miscommunication that resulted in the friendly fire.
Yeah, very likely, and he implies that too when he said many were immigrants, and if they're newly immigrants, their English was not their first language. So even that in itself, aside from cultural thoughts and experiences, the language barriers.
Yeah, and also he alludes to it being like put together at the last minute in the sense that a bunch of guys were pulled out from like the Midwest and they were just thrown in right before they're shipped off. So it's like the unit didn't even have time to get used to each other and get to know each other. They were just sent in.
Right.
So
Build that unity of a battalion.
Because once inside the forest, it was easy to lose track of time and direction. Since they had no wireless radio, they had to rely on maps and compasses. Time and again, they had been surprised by hidden German machine gun posts, and German infiltration teams were constantly trying to outflank companies that went too far ahead.
Oh.
More than once, Whittlesey's companies had lost contact with the
It was a
forces on their
strategy.
flanks, right? General Alexander gave the strict order they were to go forwards, not backwards. Major Whittlesey wholeheartedly disagreed with Alexander, and he knew the reality of frontline combat better. But there was no point in arguing. So early on the morning of October 2nd,
and that's really sucky too. It's like you get stupid orders, but you have to follow them because of chain of command, right? You're not allowed to disobey, or else you could get court-martialed. So he's ending up having to send his men into what's essentially an ambush.
An ambush and their many deaths. And you and I talked about this in another Sabaton history reaction, where the High Command were not in any way part of the. They didn't see the war zone, and they in World War I in particular, and they continued to have their men charge forward, not understanding the reality of the terrain, what was really going on in the battlefield, and it was a lot of erroneous judgments that were made.
Right, and a lot of young men, a lot of lives were wasted because of generals or in general leaders who were overly aggressive, and their pride was on the line. They're like, we gotta keep pushing.
That's what it came down to.
When in this type of situation, not necessarily, we don't even have to fall back. At the very least, we should like make a stop and like fortify our position and wait for the other regiments to catch up before we could continue to move forward. That makes the most logical sense. But yeah.
Whittlesey's battalion of roughly 550 men entered the forest, behind a creeping barrage where the German trenches were believed to be. As they marched forward, though, they noticed that the enemy was strangely silent. Here and there, terrified young boys and exhausted old men in dirty German uniforms came their way, surrendering without a fight. And hopes were high that Germany was finally coming to the end of its fighting capability, and breakthrough was close at hand. But once again, hidden machine guns and mortars opened up on them. Yet there was no continuous German line, just small nests of resistance. They pushed on until the evening and reached the top of a ravine where they suddenly stood at a major German strongpoint, but one without a single German soldier in sight. Maybe General Alexander had been right all along. Maybe the Germans were truly broken and in full retreat. Major Whittlesey ordered his men to move along, though he had not heard from the commanders on his flanks for quite a while.
Yeah, Indy is really leading us down. Like, he's making it real obvious that something's up.
Right.
And obviously, it was a trap. And this is something that's very commonly done, is if you have an ambush set, you don't just immediately start shooting as soon as you see someone. You
draw them in.
You let them come as far into the trap as possible before you box them in.
Sure.
That way you can kill off as many of your...
From all sides.
Yeah, you can kill off as many as you can and not give them time to escape backwards. So.
Right.
What he could not know was that the Germans were by no means broken. He had simply found a hole in their front line. The French and the 308th had made only little progress, and the only ones really pushing forward right now were Whittlesey's 9 companies, and the Germans were about to notice.
Oh, interesting. So maybe it wasn't a trap. Maybe they really did go through just and ended up surrounded.
By nightfall, the battalion had dug in on the side of a hill, and they arranged their machine guns around the perimeter. Major Whittlesey was then told that the men had heard German voices back from where they came. As daylight found them, so too did the German mortars. Whittlesey had around 500 men fit for action and had still heard nothing from his flanks. He sent out runners, and they thought they spotted German soldiers moving through the bushes. Now, Whittlesey had seen that before, the German infiltration tactics. So he sent out his strongest company, E Company. But were they really Germans out there, or friendly runners trying to reestablish connection? A voice came from the bushes. "Americans?" it asked. A private replied, "Yes, E Company." The response to that was a hail of hand grenades and machine gun fire. E Company was no more. The Germans had found them, and Whittlesey's worst fears had come true. He was cut off, and not even his carrier pigeons seemed able to find their way. And the German artillery was getting closer. Whittlesey was in a tight spot. He could pull back and make a break for the American lines, but he had a lot of wounded, and going back would mean leaving them out in the open. He also had no idea how many Germans were there. He chose to stay. The Germans tested them, rushing from cover to cover, baiting the Americans to fire at them and reveal their positions. And German mortars caused heavy casualties. But the Americans had an advantage. They had German immigrants in their ranks who understood the carelessly shouted German commands. This foiled attacks until night fell. The pocket was shrinking, but still held.
That's an interesting thing that I didn't even consider, is that America is very unique in the sense that many countries, most of them are like the same cultural background. They all kind of have the same race, the same history behind them, and then they have not so many immigrants. Versus America is the opposite. America is a country with lots of immigrants from all over the world. So there's basically people who speak all sorts of languages throughout America, and so it's interesting to consider that in America there was a lot of Germans. And so naturally there would be German soldiers who would be drafted into the military and who would know German, and that would kind of give them an advantage as they're serving in their unit. So
Sure.
that they could understand. And it's interesting because I didn't even consider that. It reminds me of when I used to play Call of Duty Modern Warfare 3. You're playing, it's like a game that's, I think is situated against like World War III, or in the sense there's like a war between Americans and Russians. And it's made from the perspective of that you only understand English. And so the enemies, which were the Russians in the game, they would shout out what they're about to do. It's like, brasao granato. They say like, I'm throwing a grenade. And I would understand what they're saying, so I know they're about to throw a grenade at me ahead of time. So
To be ready for that.
right.
Yeah.
So it's just interesting knowing another language, especially the language that your enemy is speaking, is such an
advantage, right?
Yeah, it's an enabler for so many things.
Yeah, and with so many German immigrants, it would make sense because one thing that most people don't know or forget with their American history is that German was almost the official American language rather than English. I think it came down to a vote. And I know someone's going to put this in the comments. I'll probably look it up afterwards. But it became, America was built a lot on the English culture and the German culture. And so a lot of Germans were here. And again, it almost became the official language over English.
Wow. Yeah, I didn't know that.
Yeah. Huh. And so it's interesting when you think about that. Had it become the official language centuries ago, what that would have done maybe for World War I, even World War II. Anyway.
Yeah, it's interesting because I never even considered that, because to me it was like I always thought like America was like America, of course, was under the control of the British for a long time, which also speak English, and then later they were kicked out by the of America. So to me, it always made sense that English is the default language because the first settlers there, who came from Europe, were speaking that language.
Yeah, I think there was a big in the very beginning, lots of contention with the Dutch, the English, and even the French.
Yeah.
It's interesting there with the Louisiana Purchase. But coming back to the video here in the history here, yeah, I think that what an advantage to have these immigrants being able to hear the military commanders on the German side giving their orders and being able to translate that. So even though they were surrounded, that advantage gave survival, I think, to many of this battalion, which I'm sure we're going to find out.
Yeah, and he mentioned till nightfall. They did that. So I wonder if that means that the Germans picked up that their carelessness was being exploited, and then they stopped being so apparent. So.
The water and food were running out fast. On the third day, water and food had run out, and the men resorted to searching German corpses for food. Whittlesey and the other officers did their best to keep up morale, and in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of France, the New Yorker attitude still came through. Every German attack was met with defiance, and every insult was promptly returned. The 77th would not be cowed and would not give up.
Interesting thing that he just mentioned there is that they didn't resort to searching the corpses until after they completely ran out of food and water, like a few days in, right? Something I'm not 100% like familiar with is what was the protocol for looting bodies, because I know it's frowned upon in some cases. I know it was very different. For example, in World War II, it was very different style of warfare on the Eastern Front versus the Western Front. Like on the Eastern Front, it's like anything goes, right? You just grab a gun off sometimes you'd even loot your enemies' articles of clothing. For example, in World War II, lots of the Germans would take Soviet boots off of dead bodies because they were higher quality than their own. So I wonder, was the reason they didn't loot the bodies right away is because they, out of respect for the dead, they didn't want to kind of like basic manners. And maybe you guys can answer that in the comments below. I'd be curious to know about that piece of history.
Yeah, I'd be curious with that. Interesting that you pull that out. And then, of course, when it became absolute necessity.
Right, like if you like in this case, if they're everyone starving, dying of or they're completely dehydrated, or maybe in the situation where you're in a in the combat in a trench and your gun runs out of ammunition, you quickly grab one off of a dead body. So I wonder if it was only in emergency situations or if it was common practice. Because I know, like I said, at least I know in World War II on the Eastern Front, a lot of looting happened where they would even like take personal items, like oh, look at this, it's a fancy watch. Let me grab that, and they'll have it on their wrist. So
Right.
In the afternoon, the shelling intensified and crept dangerously close. Then it finally hit their positions. Huge artillery shells rained down on them, and it became clear that it was American artillery. Whittlesey hurried to his birds. None had returned, and there was only one left, the handler's favorite, a black and white pigeon called Cher Ami. Whittlesey wrote, "Our own artillery is dropping a barrage directly on us. For heaven's
Friendly
sake,
fire.
stop it."
That's
And
what
his
it was.
coordinates on a piece of paper, put it in an aluminum tube, and bound it to the bird's leg. All their hopes lay with this bird, and Cher Ami took off to the next tree, where she sat peacefully on a branch watching the men who kicked the tree
Getting
and threw
shelled.
stones at the bird until she took wing again. The shelling continued and even got worse as the Germans joined in. Soon, German soldiers were breaking into the
my
pocket,
gosh.
hurling grenades as they came down the slope. Now, had they intended to kill all of the Americans, they would probably have succeeded, but instead they tried to take prisoners. This gave the battalion
why.
a chance to fight back. Machine guns ran hot. Soldiers fired at point-blank range from a wall of corpses, resisting capture once more, forcing the Germans to retreat. And night fell once again.
wow, what a photo.
Unknown to them, their story was getting attention. At first, politically, both American and German high commands knew that the destruction of the pocket would be a propaganda coup. The Germans could boast how superior their troops were, and the Americans would face political backlash back at home, and maybe even be taken out of the line. Both sides increased efforts to find them. As morning broke on the fourth day, Whittlesey and his men had no food, little ammo, and most of their machine guns were destroyed. The artillery barrage came back, but this time, it did not hit their position. Instead, falling on the Germans further north, Cher Ami had found its way to the American headquarters.
She delivered the
With
message.
a shrapnel wound and a leg blown off,
Oh,
she had
wow.
still given their coordinates to headquarters. So now,
Good pigeon.
American command knew where they were, but
It's interesting that it was the favorite pigeon and the very last one. It's like only the last one made it through. It reminds me of this interesting scene. There's in Battlefield 1. There's a tank that is getting that's completely surrounded, and their last hope was also rested on the pigeon that they sent back to their artillery. Except in that case, it was opposite because they wanted their location to be bombarded because they're overrun. So
Battlefield 1.
Battlefield 1, yeah. That's a game I think it would be
gotcha.
interesting to have Rob try out.
Probably have to check that out.
Yeah. So ready to continue?
Yep.
still didn't know their situation. In fact, Alexander was writing out orders that Whittlesey should resume the attack northwards. The Germans made plans to finally destroy the pocket. The next night, several groups of veteran stormtroops appeared at the front, ready to move in, but this time they would not take prisoners.
Wow.
Day 5. At midday came panicked shouts. Liquid fire
shoots
sprayed the
his
position,
fire,
and
yep.
a shower of grenades fell. German flamethrowers came down the slope, while from the flanks, stormtroops tore through the bushes. A violent melee began. Engulfed in smoke and flames, the pocket turned into a no-holds-barred brawl to the death. The Americans engaged the stormtroops with knives, clubs, and bayonets. Officers fired their revolvers at point-blank range. No quarter was given, no mercy was shown, and the Americans held. Barely,
Wow.
but they held. The 6th day of combat began. The men were exhausted, mentally and physically. The mood now was fatalistic, and many wrote their final letters, not expecting to come out of this alive. But the Germans sent in a letter of their own, asking
interesting.
for surrender. Whittlesey made clear there would be no surrender. High Command had sent out volunteers to establish contact. Many were intercepted by the Germans, but some eventually broke through and came in contact with the rest of the 77th Division, trying to fight its way through to the Lost Battalion. Finally, on the 8th of October, after 7 days of combat, the Lost Battalion was found.
Wow.
Food and water were rushed into the exhausted men. From the 554 men that went in, 197 were killed, and 150 were either missing or captured by the enemy. Only 194 men walked out of the pocket under their own steam, but most of them were wounded. Nearly overnight, it became the biggest American story of the war. War reporters rushed into the scene and immediately interviewed the men, which is why we have such a detailed account of the fighting. Major Charles Whittlesey and 2 other captains would receive the Medal of Honor for their actions, and Cher Ami was even awarded the Croix de Guerre.
Wow.
But all of the men had become heroes to the American public, and stories and books were written about them. They really became the all-American heroes of the war. And to this day, books, films, and songs are written about them and their stand as they have entered the realm of American legends. Okay, Lost Battalion, the song. What do you got?
Nothing.
Now, this is an interesting idea for a Sabaton song. How did you come up with the idea in the first place?
Well, over the years we've asked our fans from all over the world to give us ideas, send us emails or give us books and such. And this one is actually one of those stories. Okay. Many years back, a friend named Mike gave us a book called The Lost Battalion, actually.
So you guys do actually go through, like when people send you books and things, you do actually read them. And
yes, I mean, not everything, obviously. We get a lot of books, but everything that we think looks interesting and can be inspiration for a song. Over the years, I don't know how many thousands of emails we have got. Yeah. And I can honestly say we have read everyone, and they're all saved, except when you suggested Star Wars or such.
Okay, well, when they do their album Star Wars, we'll have to be on location for that, too.
Yes.
You can write in and ask if you want us on the ice planet Hoth or on the desert planet Tatooine when we film the Star Wars one.
Or the lava planet Mustafar.
Mustafar, right?
or water world, a.k.a. Camino.
Because those will be fun to do.
Yeah, but it'll be far, far away.
But we know there's a cantina where we can get drinks.
Oh, yes, that's good.
Before I forget, I'll tell you what. In the description, there'll be a link to that book so that anybody, because you said it was good, yeah?
Very good.
And it inspired the song.
Yes.
Now, what about the song itself? Is it just a traditional, straightforward Sabaton
No,
song?
this is very different. This one actually has a new drum kit that isn't real. I had this idea, and I had it for many, many years, but it was never turned into a reality until now.
Okay.
And the kick drum is a machine gun.
Okay.
The snare drum is a 9mm handgun.
Yeah.
And this is kind of macabre, but the hi-hat is a bayonet going into flesh.
Can we hear some of that right now?
Yeah. Made a beat with it.
Yeah.
Ah, there it is.
All right, there.
It reminds me of what Tchaikovsky did with the overture.
Oh, you mentioned that and turned it into a waltz.
No.
Right?
I'm talking about something completely different. Tchaikovsky, have you heard the overture where he uses cannons?
Yes.
As an instrument.
That's a famous one.
Yeah. So it kind of reminds me of that.
I think it's 1812 overture.
Right, yeah. Where they use, it's kind of the same principle here where they use weapons as instruments. It's kind of funny. So.
Here we are. See, I love that when that happens.
Yes.
I can also call down thunder. Never mind.
No, but it's really this idea I had for a long time, and sound production-wise, it's a nightmare,
Yeah.
So I basically took the sounds of these machine guns, 9mm guns, and everything, and I tested everything.
Yeah.
And I built, obviously this is computer-based samples, but I built a drum kit out of, sounds of death, I guess.
But that, I guess, it will bring home what these guys were actually facing. I mean, they're there for days. They're under fire, not just from the Germans, under fire from their own guys.
Yeah, and it's from that point of view, it's really one of my favorite things because finally a crazy idea I had actually worked out.
Now, I can't help but ask, how are you going to do that live?
We have done it live a couple of times, actually.
With stabbing someone in the bayonets repeatedly?
Yeah. Actually, yeah. It probably is miking them up, you know.
Oh, yeah, because they go, ow, 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 ow.
Yes.
Just the bayonet noise. That's all we want.
You need to be quiet. No, but we actually for that, Hannes is playing it live, but it's triggered by samples.
Okay.
So he's we have triggers on the drums. So when he's punching everything, it's still the sample drums we hear. We mix them with acoustic drums, so it's a mix there.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's played live because we don't want to put it on a drum machine when we have an awesome drummer, you know.
Well, that's absolutely true. All right, everybody. That was Lost Battalion from The Last Stand, which came out a couple of years ago. And if you don't know that one, you should definitely get that one. And you should also get the new one, The Great War, since we're here filming on locations from The Great War.
Yeah, that's it for today.
See you soon.
All right, everyone. As you can see, we have put the effort on. It's time for you to do it. So become a patron and do it now.
It's interesting to see it in the
I'm
background.
looking at that,
Yeah.
and I'm thinking of a few things here with future reactions.
Yeah.
All right? And don't forget to subscribe to Sabaton, Time Ghost, and World War II. Hope to see you all on the road very soon because we are releasing a kick-ass album. So let's do this.
Yeah, let's do this.
All right. Here we
Yeah, that
go.
was a good song, and I really liked Indy sharing the history behind that because I remember that being mentioned, but I had forgotten all the history behind it.
Right.
And I liked how he brought up, as you did, the eclectic battalion it was.
Right.
People that were inner city, New York, people from the Midwest, people of different backgrounds and languages, and they really stood their ground hard.
Yeah. And I found funny. He's like, it's truly an American unit.
Yeah, that's right. But remarkable that only 20%, or just barely over that, maybe 21.8% made it to at the end of the week, where they were, saved by the Americans advancing in. Just remarkable.
Yeah, and it's pretty surprising, like you said, just how out of touch high command can be. They're out of food. They're starving. They don't have any water. They're completely surrounded. They've taken heavy losses. They're getting bombed by their own guys. And the words of reassurance they receive is keep pushing forward. It's like we don't have anyone to push forward. We can barely hold our ground. It's how are we supposed to push even further out and get ourselves even further surrounded? It's pretty crazy. So.
Yeah, and we saw that. Help me recollect that with the battle that occurred in Turkey, World War I. It was the French advancing.
The Battle of Gallipoli. Yep,
that's it.
Yep.
Wow. Anyway, we got fortunate to be introduced to Sabaton, and the wheel coughed up a good one, which led us to this historical overview of the song. So
yeah, as always, we enjoyed not only listening to the song but getting an overview of the history behind it. And with that being said, we hope you guys enjoyed as well. Make sure you like, comment, and subscribe, and hit the notification bell icon to stay up to date on future videos. And with that being said, have a great rest of your week.
We'll see you soon.
All right, guys, take care.
If you try, you just buy, get it.